Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for attending today's Center for Japanese Studies and Anti-Racist Pedagogy webinar. Before I'd like to begin, I'd want to just introduce myself and talk a little bit about the format for today's presentation and discussion. My name is Reginald Jackson, and I'm Director of the Center for Japanese Studies here at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and also Associate Professor of Premodern Japanese Literature and Performance, and co-coordinator of this project along with Rachel Willis, Sophie Hasuo, and Harrison Watson. Before I introduce our distinguished guest today, I'd like to briefly explain the format and give some announcements. So your microphones and cameras have been disabled, but we invite you to submit questions during the lecture through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in the right-hand corner there. And our moderator, me in this case, will try to get through as many of those as possible after Dr. Selinger's presentation. Today, however, we're going to do things slightly differently because at Professor Selinger's request, we're going to alter the format, and what will happen is that she'll give a slightly shorter presentation, and then after that, the two of us will then discuss her insights and some of the questions that she raises about the field of pre-modern Japanese literary studies in particular, before we transition to a slightly shorter Q&A session before we close. So our hope is that beyond just being enjoyable for us in this kind of jam session that we have, it might also stimulate other types of questions and responses from the audience. In addition to this, I'd also like to make a few announcements, namely that next Thursday, June 10th, we're pleased to have Professor Mika Kennedy giving a talk at noon as well. And Professor Kennedy's talk is entitled Pedagogy for Solidarity, Teaching Japanese American Incarceration and Social Justice. So please feel free to join us for that. The links for that will be in the chat. And so you can register that way to check out that really great presentation from Professor Kennedy. Beyond that, also be aware that the recordings for previous webinars are also available through the JSAP site and are also available on the Center for Japanese Studies website and YouTube channel if you'd like to check those out. Several people have written to, many of them are in Japan who can't make the lecture today. So information for that will be up next week, and you can check that out on the YouTube site. So with that said, I just want to talk a little bit about the JSAP project. The Japanese Studies Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project, which centers BIPOC graduate students and faculty as key partners and co-organizers, is designed to develop a forum for discussing and promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the field of Japanese studies. The project's aim is to enhance awareness and quality of teaching related to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues within Japanese studies, with an explicit emphasis on anti-racist pedagogy as the basis for public-facing humanities research and professional development for graduate students. With that said, it's now my special pleasure today to introduce one of my favorite interlocutors and scholars of all things Japan, Dr. Vyjayanthi Selinger. Professor Selinger is the Stanley F. Druckenmiller Associate Professor of Asian Studies at Bowdoin College, where she teaches courses on medieval to modern topics, including Japanese animation, samurai culture, monster culture, and Japanese World War II memory. Born and raised in India, Professor Selinger moved to the United States to pursue doctoral work in Japanese literature and culture. Her research examines literary representations of conflict in medieval Japan, using conflict as the key node to examine war memory, legal and ritual constraints on war, Buddhist myth-making, and gender. Her research interests include ritual and material culture studies, sexuality and subjectivity in literature, and language pedagogy and curriculum development. Professor Selinger holds a PhD from Cornell University, a Master of Arts degree from Harvard University, and a BA from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. She has received funding from a number of organizations, including the Japan Foundation on multiple occasions, Fulbright Foundation, the Japanese Government Monbusho Scholarship in Japanese Studies, and has also been awarded the Joseph Fletcher Memorial Award for Excellence in Writing the MA thesis from Harvard University. Professor Selinger is also the author of the book, Authorizing the Shogunate, Ritual and Material Culture and the Literary Construction of Warrior Order, from Brill in 2013. And she's an active scholar in both Japan and the United States, with a commitment to publishing and presenting in both Japanese and English. Her current book project, called The Law and Letters, The Legal Imagination of Medieval Japanese Literature, for which she was awarded the Fulbright Core Scholar Award, examines how medieval writings exploit the dramatic tensions of legal disputes. As a scholar of Indian origin, she has a long-standing interest in cross-cultural flows between India and Japan, and has published a piece on the intercultural travel of the Ramayana entitled The Ramayana and the Rhizome, Textual Networks in the Work of Minakata Kumagusu in the journal Verge. Dr. Selinger has also written a number of other articles and published widely on a number of topics. Some of these, just to name a few, include The Tale of the Heike, War, Violence, and Historical Narrative in Medieval Japan, War Without Blood, The Literary Uses of a Taboo Fluid in the Heike Monogatari in Monumenta Nipponica, The Sword Trope and the Birth of the Shogunate, Historical Metaphors in Muromachi, Japan. She's also published a great review of Raj Pandi's Perfume Sleeves and Tangled Hair, Body, Woman, and Desire and Medieval Narratives. Professor Selinger has also given a number of invited talks and conference presentations related to her work in the book, but then also other topics such as Deciphering a Meal, Culinary Hospitality and Warrior Power in the Heike Monogatari, for instance, and has also things like Envisioning Female Salvation, Dream Revelation, Virtual Travel, and Karmic Overcoming in the Heike Monogatari's Kanjo no Maki. There's more that I could say about Professor Selinger's numerous publications, presentations, and articles and so forth. But I want to talk just a bit, just personally, about why we've invited her here today. When I was thinking about the roster for some of the presenters and interlocutors for this JSAP project, Professor Selinger actually was one of the very first people that I considered for a number of reasons. First of all, because she's brilliant. And the fact that she's so humble is a plus, but she doesn't wear that on her sleeve, and she is not territorial about this. She's one of the most generous interlocutors I've ever met, and I've always been impressed by the way that Vyjayanthi is able to be both incredibly prepared, but also kind of super present in all of the conversations that she has with professors, with students of all stripes. There's a kind of real generous, not just intellectual commitment to exchange, to improving the field and improving teaching, but also I think just to recognizing the humanity, the people that she's in conversation with. We've talked a lot in our own kind of personal conversations about things that might improve the field. And one of them we talk a lot about is stance. And I think that she really embodies in her teaching and her presentation style, which you'll get a sense of momentarily, what it means to come from a place of humility and also always wanting to learn and contribute, not to tear people down, not to just take up space, but to actually improve things. Which I think is both really impressive and really instructive, I think, for many of us in the field. I think that one of the things that also really impresses me about Jayanthi as a person and as a scholar is that she's able to meet people where they are and is always trying to affirm the knowledge that they have and bring to the table, as opposed to assuming a kind of arrogance or a kind of hierarchy of knowledge. I think that she's really great at flattening some of those things out as a basis for understanding. And this was really clear when we, myself and other members of the JSAP team did a podcast interview with her, which we look forward to having up a bit later this summer. But one of the things that really stood out to us, and we talked about it, but afterwards is really being impressive, I think encapsulates some aspect of Professor Selinger's style, that she talked about teaching Japanese language and what it means, for instance, to have mixed race Japanese students in the class who have their own anxieties about being authentic enough, about not having good Japanese and so forth. And one of the things she mentioned that she does in those contexts is to take the students aside, to remind them of the fact that she doesn't expect more of them based on their race or some kind of blood quantum, and to encourage them to learn, to make mistakes just like anyone else in the class would, and effectively just kind of putting them at ease, but by dispensing with the kind of ethnic nationalism and these kind of anxieties that a student with that background might have. And beyond the brilliant writing and the really kind of the commitment to centering Japanese voices and Japanese scholars' voices in her writing, that pedagogical commitment, I think, speaks volumes about that kind of combination of the kind of theoretical rigor on the one hand, but also just, again, a real empathy for students that I think shines through in lots of her work and makes all of us, I think, lucky to hear her today, but also envious of those students that have the chance to work with her on a regular basis. So much more to say. Vyjayanthi is one of my favorite academics, period. And I'm so excited for her presentation today, which is entitled Getting Started, Challenges and Opportunities in an Anti-Racist Pedagogy in Premodern Japanese Literature. So please join me in welcoming Professor Vyjayanthi Selinger.
Hello. Professor Jackson, thank you for that very generous introduction, which I feel completely unequal to. And thank you, Sophie, Rachel, and Harrison for helping with all the logistical things that have preceded this. So let me start by screen sharing. And thank you to the University of Michigan Center for Japanese Studies for organizing this thesis of this series. Okay. Is my slide looking okay?
Yes, you're great.
Thank you. So when I was invited by Professor Jackson to speak in this series, my first thought was, this is the kind of talk I would want to attend, because I too have been puzzling over how to teach pre-modern literature with an eye to fostering anti-racist modes of thinking. I teach at a small liberal arts school where I'm the only Japanese literature instructor and Japanese language instructor. So I cover everything from pre-modern literature to post-war literature. In a class entitled Literature of the Asia-Pacific War, I teach Japanese colonialism of Taiwan and Korea, as well as American neocolonialism in Okinawa. And that class has led to fruitful discussions about race and empire. That class comes equipped with many intellectual handles for students because scholarly articles themselves thematize how the construction of racial difference through photography, language, and cultural discourses confers epistemic power on colonizers. To thematize anti-racism through the teaching of pre-modern literary works is more of a challenge because the construction of difference in pre-modern literary works doesn't always track along the familiar lines of race and ethnicity. There's also not a lot of scholarship in English that traces social marginalization in literary texts, other than the ones that I will mention later in the presentation. What I will speak about today is therefore aspirational, the beginning of a roadmap, as well as how I might learn from the group assembled here so we can crowdsource ideas. In the absence of clear conceptual handles that connect race in medieval texts that might populate such a syllabus, I am guided by three questions. How do we get students to read medieval Japanese literary texts without flattening them into an Asian cultural object? How do we utilize the primary and secondary texts within our field to teach how the construction of difference confers social, political, and epistemic power? And three, how can we illustrate the nationalization of medieval texts, not simply as domestic classics, but as cultural handmaidens of colonialism? To start with, my central goal is to ensure that a student's encounter with pre-modern Japanese literature not become an exercise in making Japan into a strange other. As Sarah Ahmed has noted in Strange Encounters, we do label as strange things that we might want to xenophobically expel. But discourses of multiculturalism also employ the figure of the strange, only this time as a, open quotes, spice or taste that can be consumed by one who moves between eating places, close quotes. We likely all want to avoid what some have called this food court model of a world literature class, in which all that you get is flat Asian cultural space. In this flat terrain, there is no politics, and all tensions and inequalities are elided. Additionally, I have found that the food court metaphor is kind of like an earworm. Once you plant that image in their minds, students respond to it intuitively and brilliantly. Nor do we want students to see Japanese culture through what Francisco de Silva calls through a looking glass. This is an article on how Claude Lévi-Strauss looked at Genji. We don't want students to see a variant of things we already know to be true. A looking glass that shows your own script, but backwards. This yields a same but different view of Japan, a common humanity argument that depoliticizes texts. Finally, I am guided by Candice Chu's article, "It's Not About Anything." In it, she shows her irritation with aboutness, questions that ask what a text is about. Such questions, she says, are rubrics of convenience used to create siloed corners within the academy. Chu therefore invites us to consider a pedagogy of sensibility rather than identity. In her case, by sensibility, she means sensibilities that differ from the liberal common sense, close quotes. I approach her call not to reduce everything to content a little more expansively. Instead of, what is it about? We might instead ask, what does it do? How does it do it? And what can I do with it? Furthermore, I want to confess that I've never taught a class along these that has these specific modules, though these modules are cobbled from things that I do teach. I think I definitely ought to begin, and I'm hoping for many conversations where we do this thinking together as a field, creating the exciting conversations happening in race before race for medieval studies, undisciplining Victorian studies, whose title is self-evident, and multicultural classics for the classics. Rebecca Futo Kennedy's blog is particularly fruitful, and it contains a lot of great resources. I have invited Professor Jackson to speak after I conclude to ask how he is interpreting these conversations and how his own pedagogy is evolving along these lines. I'm sure you're all curious, as I am, about that. I would like to begin with a case study, sharing how I go about teaching the Tale of the Heike, my area of study. I did, in fact, teach this material this past semester in a class entitled Samurai in History, Literature, and Film. In the latter half of the presentation, I'll be dealing with more macro issues, such as reading lists for specific modules. But I'd like to begin on a micro level, at the level of classroom praxis. I offer this not because I've figured out how to do this, but precisely because I haven't. You will see as I move through my examples the opaqueness of the connection to anti-racist pedagogy when I'm dealing with truly medieval material. But once I switch to a more modern moment, things click into place. I hope I hear a collective sigh of relief in this Zoom room, our recognition of the shared puzzling when we try to make this connection. Yet I think it is important to start thinking through the concrete, to think about how, in the absence of handily available handles for such teaching, how instructors might get creative. I'll begin by discussing how I teach an episode called The Death of Kisano Yoshinaka, illustrating how it can serve as a rich vein to tap a whole range of questions. The what is it question reduces this episode to what it depicts about vanquished samurai. To turn students' attention to what does it do and how does it do it, I direct students to the text's silences. I begin by telling the students to appreciate how the text idealizes two men who choose to die together, even sending away a female lover in order to do so. I'm explicit with my students that if we don't break this spell of the idealization of a hyper-masculine ending to these men, we will too easily connect this text to kamikaze pilots and the Japanese fighting spirit in the modern period. What such a male homosocial reading occludes is the flow of desire between a homosocial pair, foster brothers, and a heterosexual pair, Tomoe and Kiso Yoshinaka, something that Sachi Schmidt's forthcoming article on foster brothers will help students see. Next, I ask them to observe the absence of blood and broadly consider the aestheticization of violence. We tackle two theories. We read excerpts from Morton Oxenbould, who argues that these stories are about, open quotes, the cultural superiority of the elite warrior, close quotes. Oxenbould argues that such, open quotes, aesthetic displays of bravery served as reminders of control by warrior elite, close quotes. We also read excerpts from my article, where I show that the deliberate silence around blood on the bodies of the vanquished guarantees their karmic salvation, absolving both killer and killed from karmic sin. I ask students to consider how the blind chanters, who were seen as outcasts, might have voiced the narrative, seeking karmic amelioration. The silence around blood is an artifact of the storytellers, who, even as they carry around negative karma as custodians of death stories, seek to expiate it. Students have to negotiate between reading what the absences secure for the politically powerful and what the absences mean for the marginalized. As listeners are no doubt wondering, how I teach this particular episode may seem distant from what we might readily see as anti-racist pedagogy. My motives are quite modest. I'm asking students to read between the elite-focused presentation of the episode and the karmic burden of its outcast chanters, tensions that are manifested in its silences. The next example is when I bring students to the college museum for a visit, where they examine the lacquered objects and swords that are often found in college collections. They read Morgan Pitelka's piece on how these objects elevated the status of samurai who collected them and gave them as gifts. At the same time, I have them read selections from a piece called The Ethnicities of Things in America's Lacquered Age, to think about the ways in which objects that end up in our college collections reflect 19th century ideas of which things represent a culture. Students think about how the ornamental view of Japan that these objects curate as a land of beautiful objects helped create a racial hierarchy in 19th century America, at a time when America itself was boasting instead about its steamboats, its trains, and its telescopes. The article by Watabe, as the title suggests, topicalizes historical amnesia and helps break the spell that quote-unquote mystical swords cast on students. Having outlined some very specific ways in which I connect material fairly distant from social marginality to practices of reading broadly attuned to prejudice, I would like to move into specific modules that I have taught or would like to teach using old and newly emerging scholarship. Let me start with where the scholarship is most deep and wide, Discourses of Pollution and Social Marginality in Medieval Japan. My apologies if I have left out pieces written by scholars in the audience. I've presented a few representative works here in chronological order to show how the scholarship has been evolving. Nagahara Keiji's article kickstarted a medieval turn, at least in English language scholarship, pivoting from theories of state-led institutionalization of the outcast order in Tokugawa Japan towards medieval theories of pollution and impurity. Around this time, literary scholars also started examining the ideology of pollution and purification, linking it, as Mikhail Mara does, to the Buddhist myth-making of defilement, or as Thomas Kierstead does, to how the construction of the profane is a structural prerequisite to make the emperor sacred. Scholars now favor the social explanation, arguing that socially marginalized subjects have ideas of pollution attached to them in a post facto way. When students encounter these readings, they often have to negotiate between institution-centric explanation and socially rooted explanations. On this next page, though I have not taught it yet, I have picked up Max Moorman's recent piece because it allows students to think through on their own these causal explanations in the context of a specific text, the Onsenji Engi. The bathhouse trope, as he notes, is a common trope for managing defilement. I would also like to spotlight Janet Goodwin's work and a recent translation of Kuroda Hideo's work. And finally, though I have not read it carefully, I picked up this recent article by Yasuko Takezawa because it takes up Geraldine Heng's call in The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages to enter Japanese discourses of pollution into this much broader conversations so that others can get read up on it. I find the publication venue, Ethnic and Racial Studies, itself an invitation to think broader. Again, none of these examples get us to race as we understand it in modern terms. However, I'm inspired by Geraldine Hung's broad formulation of race making as the process by which, open quotes, strategic essentialisms are posited and assigned so as to construct a hierarchy of peoples for differential treatment, close quotes. These readings help students see these strategic essentialisms. But how can we deepen these modules without proposing a false equivalence between race and caste? Professor Ani Alumba's piece is very useful in that she topicalizes the politics of the denial of comparability. Her question revolves around why we hesitate to compare caste in India with racial discourses, why we pause at the divide between scientific and biological discourses of racism and cultural and religious discrimination. Lumba is extremely mindful of what such conflations might erase, minding Stuart Hall's call that we don't, open quotes, extrapolate a common universal structure to racism, close quotes. And she makes a case for understanding different racisms in their historical specificity. But at the same time, she also makes a case to interrogate how denials of comparability also have their own history within colonial and exceptionalist arguments. A good example of such denialism is the Dowa Council Policy Report in 1965, which, while acknowledging, open quotes, that buraku discrimination in a modern society is an infringement of civil rights and freedom, close quotes, also simultaneously argued that discrimination against Hisabetsu Burakumi was not based on race, but rather social status, since the Japanese were, quote unquote, one race. This is mentioned in Bill Weatherall's The Racialization of Japan. Discourses of comparability also have their own history. Timothy Amos extends the racializing of outcast groups backwards in time to see how early modern thinkers in Japan xenophobically played up theories that outcasts were racialized foreign bodies that came from China or Korea in order to legitimate discourses of discrimination. Outcast communities in early modern Japan used counter theories, linking themselves with Indian deities to validate their social standing within Buddhist communities. By looking at these longer histories of comparability and denials of comparability, we arrive at a more complex narrative of how discourses of race and caste intersect. The next module is inspired by conversations that Professor Jackson and I began in a conference entitled Medieval Unfreedoms, organized at Binghamton University by Roberta Strupoli and her colleagues. In that conference, Professor Jackson gave a talk about Jinen Koji, a play about a girl who sells herself into slavery, and talked about what it means to depict enslavement on stage. I can't wait to see it published so we can assign it. He's also been teaching this past year using Thomas Nelson's article on slavery in Japan, which he shared with me as a resource. And I hope we can talk about how he taught this course after I'm done. As I sought to create my own future syllabus, I stumbled upon more recent scholarship from 2019 that may serve as an additional resource. I'm eager to hear about how we might expand this module, including by spurring more scholars to write about it. Ever since the publication of Wondrous Brutal Fictions, I have been mulling over what conceptual handle I might use to teach it. In Amida no Munewari, two siblings sell themselves, one of whom is purchased for her liver. In Sayohime, a girl sells herself into slavery. In Sansho Dayu, a mother and child are split up by slave traders. The son later becomes the governor of a province and forbids slavery. As Professor Susan Matisoff has noted, These tales may reflect the gloomy lives of Sekkyo chanters themselves, who chanted about worldly suffering. In addition to giving voice to suffering through what Professor Gary Ebersole calls sympathetic identification and compassion, these tales also erase the pain and suffering of those sold into slavery by transfiguring it into Buddhist redemption. This short reading about slavery in Buddhism by Eric Reinders might help students clue into that. It shows that slavery was both a historical practice in Buddhism and an existential metaphor of how one's suffering is the result of a karmic debt. All in all, I'd like students to think about what cultural work these unfree bodies do. Do they remind spectators of their own freedom? Does their suffering help to highlight Buddhist discourses of compassion? What Susan Burns, as I'll mention shortly, calls the economy of salvation. If others have taught it with a lens trained on human unfreedom, I would love to hear. I'm eager to hear about other scholarly articles that can be assigned to ask how human difference is redrawn in these stories. As you will see on this next list, the last decade has seen a resurgence of interest in illness as a social metaphor in medieval Japan. For those of us who have taught Yamai no Soshi and looked for English language discussions, Professor Watanabe has an excellent essay in this edited book in Japanese, and fortunately, his article is in English. Extending Professor Kasuya Makoto's work on how diseases get written onto the body as social metaphors in medieval Japan, he argues that in Yamai no Soshi, anxieties about illness, open quotes, were hoisted into the already marginalized to be that other, close quotes. Paraphrasing Kasuya Makoto, he notes, open quotes, renditions of illness transfigured anxieties about disease, sought to control the volatile energy of urban life, and fulfilled fantasies that allowed Goshirakawa and his circle to envision the other, not out of empathy, but as a form of domination and projection of their own concerns and desires, close quotes. What I deeply admire about this piece is the erudition of Professor Watanabe, his reach into diverse areas of scholarship, as well as his ability to keep both Dr. Kasuya's and his own points on two parallel tracks, so that we always have a sense of the originality and voice of both without one dominating the other. Such voicing that weaves in without appropriating is in itself inclusive and anti-racist critical praxis. I think our field is broadly starting to rethink about how collaboration with Japanese scholars should look like. Professor Burns, in her piece, focuses on those who have suffered from Daibyo, or Hansen's disease. She examines Buddhist didactic storytelling to argue that there was a, open quotes, economy of salvation that required their visibility, close quotes. That is, the sickness of Daibyo sufferers was routed into discourses of the charitable deeds of their benefactors. Another scholar who's doing work in this field of illness is Yamamoto Satomi. My thanks go to my colleagues, Christina Lathin and Keller Kimbrough, who oversaw the editing of the first several issues of the Studies in Japanese and Literature and Culture, where this is published, which is bringing all this Japanese scholarship to light so it can be assigned in classes. I would like to segue here to a work by a colleague at Bowdoin, Professor Belinda Kong, in an article entitled Pandemic as Method. In this piece from 2019, Kong was writing about the discursive mobilization of the 2003 SARS virus, but of course her work became highly relevant in the COVID world. Kong mobilizes the idea of bio-Orientalism to describe the discursive projection of disease onto Asians or Asian Americans. More specifically, she wants us to denaturalize the pandemic as an event, but see it as a method. That is, to notice the co-optation of the language of microbial emergence into American defense policy, and the leveraging of incidents of bioterrorism, such as the Omo Shindikyo incident, to expand US military resources for biosecurity. As she notes, Asia becomes the site from which highly conjured pandemic scenarios of SARS and bird flu legitimize national biosecurity, and Orientalist tropes of quote unquote unhygienic culinary traditions underwrite formulaic stories of Asian bodies as hosts to microbes within what she calls, open quotes, imagined geography of pandemic Asia, close quotes. I think we're going to be analytically thinking about the COVID pandemic and how it raised the ugly head of anti-Asian American racism and discourses of national security for a long time. In this next module, I once again repeat the analytical move, or should I say the analytical remove, from medieval works that I spoke of in the illness section. In the last 3 years, we've had conferences and edited volumes led by Reiko Onuma and Barbara Ambrose, turning our attention to how the depictions of animals constructs the relationship between Buddhist texts and their various others. In her article mentioned here, Professor Ambrose counters our typical romanticized reading of Buddhist tales, in which we see animals, plants, etc., as having the potential to achieve salvation. Ambrose instead turns our attention to the politicization of animal cruelty. The Buddhist rhetoric of compassion to prohibit meat eating or to promote the release of animals, she notes, are, open quotes, sacrificial polemics to assert its moral and religious superiority, close quotes. Her article is careful not to invoke the oft-repeated binary that the human is conceived in opposition to the animal, but she does use the expression persistent otherness, which I find useful. The literature on politicization of animals in Japan is deep. This ranges from essays on ethno-nationalist assertions that Europeans brought meat eating to meat-abhorring Japan, as extreme ethno-nationalists such as Kobayashi Yoshinori would say, or allegations of animal cruelty levied against Hisabetsu Burakumin today. As I leaped in my previous module from the medieval to the contemporary, I also leap here to a book by a political scientist called Claire Jean Kim. Her case study is the fights that are broken out in Chinatowns over an animal cruelty. On the one hand, animal rights activists claim Asian cruelty in the slaughter of animals. The activists in Chinatown counter with histories of racist representation linking Asian Americans to animals. Through her case study, Kim shows that race, species, and nature are, as her, what she calls taxonomies of power that constitute each other, and that debates over species inform debates over race. Obviously, the fight over animal cruelty resonates with our particular moment of racism in the politicization of animal slaughter in the Wuhan meat market. Why not, as the title of her book suggests, have students think about race, species, and nature in a multicultural age through the politics of compassion and cruelty towards animals? As my listeners have no doubt clued in by now, there are inherent difficulties to get at race directly through premodern material. What I've offered is my own idiosyncratic way of making these connections by focusing on racism directed towards Asian Americans. Others, no doubt, will make their own idiosyncratic connections, linking it to indigenous peoples or necropolitics against Black bodies. As the title of my talk today suggests, we are just getting started. As scholars increasingly make these connections in fine-tuned ways, we will have more essays to assign. Having offered a few modules that would spark thinking for students, I will conclude with a module I personally like to teach about Momotaro. I'm sure there are many articles that convey how medieval Japanese texts serve as cultural handmaidens of colonialism. But I tell students that Momotaro is of particular interest to me because I hail from one of those countries in the South Seas imaginary. And because it is often argued that the Momotaro story originates in the Indian epic Ramayana. If you try to make a connection between the Ramayana and the Momotaro, it becomes a flat conversion between something being the origin and the other as adaptation. This very vocabulary of origin and adaptation has a history in what Devin Griffiths calls the age of analogy, the racially inflected systematization of cultures as bounded unities implied in concepts like the global and the local. To challenge such thinking, we have to adopt more denationalized and de-hierarchized modes of connectedness. So I tell students that something like the Momotaro story was continually in motion across the medieval world, not contained by a culture. In the modern colonialist context, however, this Momotaro story becomes a quintessentially Japanese folktale that inculcates imperial sensibility for conquest. As Bob Tierney shares in his article listed here, Momotaro is a propaganda mascot in World War II cartoons, fighting against the British in Singapore, or quote unquote, liberating Southeast Asia from their demonic colonizers. All in all, I think the unit can get students thinking about how folklore works both in the service of Japan's imperialist goals, as Noriko Ryder's article here focuses on, as well as getting them to think about how arguments about indigenization of folklore are nationalist as well. In lieu of a conclusion, I'd like to state that my larger goal in designing these modules is to think about how we might teach racial literacy through courses that might not always lend themselves to it. And by letting myself not be tethered to the social and political context of texts as we typically think of them, I'm opening up my syllabus to other ways of framing questions. I would be eager to learn how we expand the creative possibilities of what we teach in different ways. What do we gain when we fully embrace the anachronism of such teaching? To return to Chu, what might it mean for us to, open quotes, collaborate across and despite institutional knowledge formation, close quotes, to step away from our own intellectual training and tradition to think about the strange affinities of, open quotes, comprehending the world in uncommonsensical ways, close quotes. Other recent ways of thinking about anti-racist pedagogy that I know of have included asking how the language classroom, the pipeline to our field, can become more attuned to race and representation. Our colleague Christina Laffin has been collaborating with Japanese language faculty to create open educational resources, highlighting the intersectional work done by queer scholars to challenge dictionaries and revamp the curriculum. Instead of asking for her syllabi, which erases her effort, we might invite her and her colleagues to speak at our home institutions. My greatest thanks, my greatest thanks go to Professor Jackson for not just inviting me here, but organizing this whole series with his brilliant students, Sophie, Harrison, and Rachel. It is immense labor communicating with us speakers, but also supporting us through our questions about how we ought to structure this fledgling effort. I can share that I myself spoke to Professor Jackson on several occasions, and he ought not to be the point person for these conversations, and that load should be shared by us all. How we get there should be the subject of our future conversations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Selinger, for that incredibly rich presentation and the kind words. And, you know, I'm sure that Rachel and Sophie and Harrison also appreciate that. So many thoughts that I want to share and kind of hear from you about as well. To your point, maybe just to kind of begin about how labor is can potentially be erased. We did have a question from recently graduated student, Jia Yuan, who's great and has actually written on Heike, so you guys should talk. So Jia, you should feel free to
Yes.
get in touch with Professor Selinger. Clearly, she has lots of brilliant things to say about Heike in particular. But she says, I'm really interested in reading the works cited in the presentation. I was wondering if it would be possible for Professor Selinger to share the slides with us after the talk today. And I don't want to speak for you, Jayanthi, and you shouldn't feel pressure to do that, but I would also say this talk is being recorded. It will be up on YouTube. And one of the things maybe to start our conversation is to just think about like what labor looks like in these different contexts. I mean, I think that Jayin, I know, is super smart and super industrious. And so it's not about just convenience. It's about just wanting to learn.
Yeah.
But I do think that particularly in this moment, and you've talked about this a little bit since you drew attention to the labor, there is, it can be, the devil's advocate reading is that they're around these kind of questions about race, about discrimination and so forth, particularly in the context of protests of last summer, Black Lives Matter and so forth, the kind of perpetual like reading lists of things that and so forth that arise out of that, which can be both well-intentioned, but can also be a kind of, Band-Aid on a cannon wound kind of thing. Like, what does it mean to actually invite conversation or, put the burden on folks to do some of that work themselves? So I think that if you could talk a little bit about your own kind of thinking around these things. I mean, I know that you're as an incredible undergraduate pedagogue in particular. I'm sure you have students who probably ask you for things, and not just insights, but then also trying to, what it means to help somebody understand certain very difficult issues, as opposed to kind of opening space for one to do some of that work on their own.
Right. I think it is. So I might think about it in two ways. The first is, collaboration. I'm very happy to share what I said and the slides. And as my slides showed, I am frequently using scholars from different areas of study to inspire, modules I'd like to develop. So, it's an encouragement to undergraduate students and graduate students to follow this undisciplining process that I myself undertook, to step out of my discipline and to see that. But to speak to the labor issue, I think we often find ourselves in that we often advise undergraduate theses, right, on things things we are not, is that doesn't immediately fall into our fields. And I often advise my undergraduate students that if they find a syllabus that another professor has helpfully posted, they should write to them and thank them that that this became a part of their intellectual journey, because otherwise it remains invisible, that work and the thinking that it prompted. And so to never ask, can I have your syllabus, but to say, I was really interested in what you said. Is there one other reading you might point me to? And to not take that labor for granted. So to turn that question back to you, Reggie, how do you think we ought to go about it, recognizing that labor it takes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's characteristically, you're suggesting very concrete techniques for acknowledging the human who's doing the labor, and opening space for a kind of conversation, right, that's not just extractive. And I think that I'm particularly sensitive to that these days. I mean, partially because, and I know that you've been really active at your own institution doing diversity work, and there's these ways in which I think particularly folks of color, scholars of color at this moment have been called to, for their insights and their input. We don't necessarily have a monopoly on that, I think, but that's that's separate from what the institution might recognize in terms of its own deficiencies, in terms of hiring practices, in terms of leadership positions around some of this now crisis around,
Yeah.
racial reckoning, et cetera, anti-Asian
Yes.
hate and so forth, and what it means to kind of at least perform a kind of care. And so
Right.
I'm really sensitive to that. I think that, and that sensitivity is not just about resentment. It's actually about trying to do exactly what you're saying, which is to kind of interrupt this relatively thoughtless, too convenient, right, relation to the material. And so, I think that your idea is great, that I think that students and scholars should absolutely write to people directly and ask to have a conversation. And one of the things that also happens there is that to something that you began with saying, that also helps to interrupt this convenient fiction of expertise and that hierarchy that they can go unchallenged as long as someone is anonymous on the internet, just kind of taking great ideas and not citing those necessarily, or not kind of really pointing to those things. I mean, I've seen that happen a lot around folks who I think are really ill-intentioned, trying to respond to or to be good allies, but I think in a necessarily clumsy way, and I think moreover without understanding all of the work that goes on. So it's one thing to post a quote or to do that kind of slacktivism of putting something up on Instagram, as opposed to actually make oneself vulnerable to these kind of more difficult conversations. And so I think that's something that actually risks kind of showing the ways in which we're not expert in these things that we would like to be, I think is really useful, particularly in relation to students. I mean, so I think one of the things I always appreciate about what you do is again, I mentioned it before, but that coming from a space of humility, and not false humility, but because it's very clear. I mean, you're incredibly erudite, and I think your presentation demonstrates that, as does all of your writing. But that premise, I think I want to go back to, because you mentioned it, this kind of stance, maybe is a way to kind of turn it around, because you mentioned how important it is, I think, to think about that rhetorical stance in terms of citational practices in particular. And I appreciated kind of how you were featuring a range of scholars, many of them scholars of color, in your presentation, as a kind of anti-racist practice. And I think that's a really important takeaway to consider in terms of, and it's an ethic as well. And I think that one of the things that's fascinating to me is when you have fields where the kind of demographically, because of the often boutique nature of the fields, at least in the kind of often Anglophone kind of context, say, means that what we might call diversity of voices is not there. It might necessitate going outside the field and looking at folks like Stuart Hall, or looking for folks like Candace Chu working in Asian American literature, cultural studies, to be able to enrich that bibliography.
To speak to the ethic, it's something I have been thinking about and grappling with since graduate school. And that is, and this, this was topicalized in one of the Race Before Race conversations conferences, which was called Appropriations, where many of the papers dealt with citation, a certain kind of citational practice as an appropriation within the field of medieval studies. But also, when you have literatures that have different linguistic homes, some people are writing in English and some people are writing in French, how do you, credit and weave the insights of another scholar without, overriding it with your own voice? And I'm, not sure we have the answers, but I think we ought to ask the question. And just by asking the question, open up some space for different kinds of voicings. As I mentioned in my talk, I liked Professor Watanabe's voicing, but every time I notice a different kind of voicing, I dance a little jig, saying, "Okay, here's someone who is thinking about this." When we're working with multiple discipline, multiple, working between languages. And though I didn't have a chance to spotlight it in my talk, Sachi Schmidt has a new initiative called Springboard Japan, in which she's also trying this very parallax method of featuring Japanese scholars in their writing alongside scholars writing in English, so that the two are in conversation and hear and learn from each other without one appropriating the other. So I'm really enjoying these kinds of projects that are coming up and that embody this ethic, or at least this question: how ought we to write?
Yeah, thank you. I've just only become recently aware of Sachi Hori Schmidt's project, but it sounds really, really great as a way to kind of, I don't know what it means to level the playing field, but at least to kind of move in a less appropriative or expropriative manner, I think is always a good idea. I want to go to some other things that you mentioned in the talk and ask you to follow up a little bit. I'm a fan of Candace Chu's work, certainly. And we've talked with the other folks in the JSAP project about Imagine Otherwise and what it means to imagine otherwise more broadly. But, I hear that question that you mentioned as kind of something that counters this notion of rubrics of convenience in terms of not what is it about or what does it mean, which can too easily default into these, pretty hackneyed interpretive things that don't actually cause much kind of self-reflection, right? But what does it do, which I think of as very much a performance studies question.
Yes.
What does it do? And it reminds me too of folks like Eve Sedgwick's work on texture.
Yeah.
And like in that from performance studies vein, and one of the things that seems really productive about that is what that does to disorganize these kinds of paradigms of these hierarchies and paradigms of objectivity or of a kind of distance from the object, this kind of myth of the scholar, right. Who is separate from that. And so I'd love to hear more about in your classes, for instance, kind of how these things play out, like what shape does this take? I mean, in a great way, you're teaching across various, periods and contexts. So just wondering if there's certain assignments or certain kind of reactions that you have from students around this kind of thing. And also the disappointed student maybe who really wants to know, who's like, is coveting this notion of like what it means. I just came here to know what samurai mean, or what this particular scene of this anime means. And why are you copping out by not giving me what I want?
I think so. It is a challenge because I think, when Professor Chu makes this, polemical statement, it's not about anything, which I really love. Like it is a kind of earworm that once in your head, you just it asks you to change, like a train shunting. You have to like change tracks when you say if it's not about anything. I think students are generally game, right? They're generally game to, when you say, okay, we can look at it in this light, we can say it's about this. But if you change your perspective and just ask, well, what does it do? What does it do for readers then? What might it have done for readers in the 20th century? What does it do for me, and how does it do it? It actually puts them within the interpretive frame. Like you can't be distanced from that object of study because you're in it. Because what does it do always features you within that interpretive frame. So I think students are game when we like say, okay, don't pay attention to not just to what it says, but its silences as well. And what do you see? And they can get really creative around that, right? They're really creative that generates the Nasu no Yoichi episode. Once you start asking what does it do, the students get very creative around how the aestheticization of the sunset, in that scene, what does it do? What does it do within, that scene and its adjacent scenes? What might it do to them? Like, what does the aestheticization, how does it work? They totally catch on to it. But, I think stepping back from classroom practice, Professor Chu's stance is a kind of refusal, right? That I refuse to be a content generator, and I refuse to make this text be a content generator. That is also interesting. Like once you can clue students into that refusal, they see it. By and large, they see it. They can understand that refusal, right? Like, I refuse to teach you this just as content, they come to embody it. I'd be curious to hear how, you incorporate performance studies into your classes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I try when we can perform, we try to perform. I'm by no means a professional, but we can do some shimai and some mutai in a course about no, and try to think about reading through scenes, for instance, and, performance analysis. We have plenty of NHK videos, which is a limited but very useful,
Right.
well filmed, kind of clear from which to draw. So things like that. I think that one of the things that's interesting about this relates to another question I want to ask, but I think is like what it means to not in a lazy way actually, but in hopefully a principled way, to allow for you're calling undisciplining, but to be inexpert. So in expert,
Yes.
as opposed to, as part and parcel of this pedagogical project. So, one doesn't have to be a professional no actor or, biwahoshi or whatever it happens to be, to try to do a good performance or compelling performance. And one of the things that's interesting, to notice with students when I've done this in the context of no is that when you read something like, say, the beginning of the kiri of the play Yashima, and you look at, you read the text and then you look at the shimai, particularly with warrior plays,
Yeah.
they're actually quite mimetic. So, that scene where you, kind of take the fan and it becomes a shield, for instance, know
Right.
what that is. You don't have to know anything about Japanese. You don't
Right.
have to have studied a lick of that.
Right.
And it makes sense and it's compelling. And, when you understand something about the conventions, but even if you don't, frankly, there's a lot that you can say. And so you have routinely drama students who, with all due respect, can run laps around the students who know a lot about Japanese culture, because the students who know, in some ways too much about Japanese culture are overly focused on getting it right as opposed to seeing how it feels, like seeing how it sounds in their voice, right? And so that fear of getting it wrong, that rubric of expertise actually is really counterproductive to kind of seeing what it does. And so there's an interesting tension. It's really productive, and I don't think anybody that goes home to cry themselves asleep. But I think it's really great in that context to have, students from all these different backgrounds who aren't afraid to approach it. And now, of course, that can be appropriative and so forth in these different ways. But the students who are going to a text with an idea of what they can do with it, like how they can work it into their own performance practice, say, or whatever. I think encouraging that kind of rapport with these objects, these cultural objects, is really great. And it sounds like you're doing that a lot with some of the museum work that you've done and the exhibitions and so forth. That's really wonderful.
Might I just say, in praise of inexpertise, I love it. Like, let us praise inexpertise.
Yeah, and there's a time. I'm not saying. I think that it's not about being grammatically incorrect or something like that. But I think that something that, in relation to something you said earlier, one of the things that, for all kinds of reasons that we can get into, like the disciplinary history of pre-modern Japanese studies, again in the States, also in Japan to a certain degree, but I think to historicize what's going on in this kind of Cold War era in terms of that real tension between, say, Asian American studies, ethnic studies, the rise, kind of development of African American studies in these departments, ethnic studies departments, particularly in California, and very much versus the area studies departments, particularly as it relates to Asia. One of the things that happens there is that there's a kind of deliberately apolitical kind of fetish about, that's very much sponsored by the U.S. government, especially. I kind of joke with, I saw a question from a prospective graduate student, like what it means to be funded by, and I'm very grateful to funding from the Japan Foundation and from the Fulbright Foundation. But I know that, the fact that I work on traditional Japanese culture in a very legibly traditional way
Yeah.
absolutely helps in
Yes.
in ways that
Yeah.
work by Andrea Mendoza, say,
Yeah.
or by Anne Maria Shimabuku on
Right.
Okinawa,
Right.
is not ripe for funding support,
Right. Right.
and that work is absolutely incredible
Yes. Yes.
on the one hand, and therefore, right,
Yeah.
right, is therefore is actually maligned as either too contemporary, not
Right.
rigorous enough, right.
Right.
So I just want to kind of have that in the background, particularly
Yes.
since it looks like there are participants who, many students, but then also folks in the field who I think are sensitive to these things, but also we take
Yes.
it for granted, and so I just don't want to kind of speed past that too quickly, but I have another question, and I think it relates
Yes.
to, I mean, it's partially about citation, it's partially about um, something you said earlier about and mentioning the move from Hall to Lumba,
Yeah.
uh, and I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about this notion of the denial of comparability, right, and how we should understand that and how we should move away from that, the stakes of that, and particularly I'm thinking about this moment where I've certainly heard, and I know that you have because we've talked about this, if one is submitting, whether this is for an article or a book proposal or whatever, or, at conferences when people, um, you know, um, why, but that's not relevant here,
Right. Right.
right? Like, why are you bringing that foreign thing? Let's say it's something
Right.
about, say, critical race theory, which is on the
Right.
outs
Right.
right now, kind of state legislatures around the country into this discussion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the
Mm-hmm.
presumption, like what's going on there is partially about territoriality. It's partially about ignorance
Right.
masquerading as caution,
Right.
right? So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we should understand that unwillingness to kind of venture out, and how we should kind of address that.
Um, yeah, how we address it, much larger question. But I think go back to Professor Chu again, who, has just great ways of, in all her pieces, getting us to think about how our fields form themselves to produce knowledge that's not just, uh, confined within a discipline, but because it's confined within a discipline, it's reproducible within the discipline and therefore reproduces the discipline, right? So she, does a great job of thinking along those lines. But to return to Professor Lumba's piece, I approached when I read it, it was with this question of, yeah, we always hesitate to compare caste in India to, outcast discrimination in Japan. And we hesitate further when we compare it to race for good reasons, for all kinds of good reasons. But, reading her piece, I think it's a productive intellectual move that we might repeat in many ways, right? So, yes, we hesitate and deny comparing these things, but why do we do so? And what historical, how were the historical discourses about denying this comparability shaped by colonialism, by nationalism, and that how and that comparability that other activists may have claimed comparability for their own reasons um, that empower them and make them help them have transnational alliances, like the Indian activist Jyotirao Phule in early 20th century, in late 19th century, early 20th century India, would make this connection as well between India and Japan. So I think it's a really cool analytical remove where you can say, okay, so we hesitate to compare. Where is the hesitation coming from? And what
Precisely, yeah.
discourses is enmeshed in.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think Professor Takujitani was doing the same, right? Like, why do we hesitate to, in his talk, why do we hesitate to mix Asian American studies with, Japanese America with Japan? Where is the history of that? Where lie the histories?
That reluctance, yeah.
That reluctance. So I don't know if I answered your question entirely.
No, that's super helpful, and indeed, and along these points, I just wanted to. I asked Harrison, one of the JSAP contributors, to put into the chat, partially because I'm looking at the Q&A, and I think Torkel Dethi, who's here, asked. I'll get to his question in a little bit, but about the utility or the potential pitfalls, or that might kind of arise from trying to transpose, say, what we might think of as contemporary discourses about race to a context, or pre-modern context, let's say pre-modern Japanese context. And that's an issue.
Yeah, that is an issue.
That's an issue. I mean, this is to the point of this entire talk. I mean, you and I've talked a lot about this. And so as partially as answer to your question, Torkel, and I think is a question that lots of pre-modern Japanese scholars have. I've found really productive Geraldine Hung's work. And the invention of race in the Middle Ages, partially because one of the things that she points out is that the European context, at least, kind of race is really kind of in some ways a function of religion. So kind of categorizing Jews and Muslims, as apart from Christians, and then later on these kind of phenotypical kind of questions of clothing and dress and so forth really become. They accrue to this, but it's actually in some ways begins as a religious distinction. I think that's really helpful along the lines of what you're pointing out from the whole and so forth, about how important it is to historicize race and different types of race and discourses of race and racism. Along these lines too, I'm just going to put this in the chat as well, partially because what would a talk about pre-modern Japanese studies be without quotes from brilliant Black feminist thinkers, I think this is it. Yeah. So this is my favorite kind of operating definition of racism from Ruthie Gilmore, from Golden Gulag. And she says that racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And this is a definition we use in the class, the Anti-Racism in Japanese Culture class that the JSAP team taught this past semester. And one of the things I love about this is that it's not about phenotype. It's not about skin color. It's not about even location. It leans modern because of the question of the state sanction. You have to think about what happens before we have a nation state. Nevertheless, this part about it can be extra legal as well. And the production of this kind of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death is something that I was thinking about, partially in relation to what you're saying about kind of marginalized or kind of outcast communities and buraku, right? Hisabetsu, burakumin, and we read some really great things. One of them was a piece by, I think it was Eric Brown, but also Keisuke Yamada, and we'll put those links up on the JSAP site and so forth. And one of the arguments there is, interestingly, that on the one hand, certainly there's discrimination before the modern era, but you do have then in the modern era against burakumin, redlining. You have kind of worse health infrastructure, right? You have all of these things that actually track pretty well against other types of racially discriminate, groups. And so on the one hand, they are not a separate race, but in practice, in terms of what it does, what these state policies do, what these kind of housing, health policies do, they produce actually a kind of racialization of this kind of native Japanese population in a way that is actually absolutely comparable to the condition of, say, African Americans, right? Or kind of other types of populations, right? Let's say Dalit communities in India, et cetera, right? So I think that's one of the things to kind of think about is that there are these connections. And I really, one of the things that I love your work on blood is that, you don't, there's all kinds of really fascinating work being done in Indigenous studies and, Black studies about blood quanta and the ways in which, right, the kind of politicization of blood as a category, right, that doesn't exist in the same way in, say, Japanese studies. And that's not to fault the field, but it's just to say, but there are more interesting ways
Right.
like objectively more interesting, much more generative ways to think about this, that, might not quote apply perfectly,
Right.
but can spark a kind of thinking that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And I think that's really one of the
Right.
inspirations I take from the work that you've been doing. Yeah.
I like the word generative, and this is to respond to Torkel's question about transposing these models. So my thinking, so my broad goal is racial literacy, right? So if my goal is how am I building racial literacy through my course on pre-modern Japanese literature, it's just the fact that my goal is racial literacy and not necessarily what does my discipline think of how these things played out, um, then it gives me in some sense the freedom to hold these more modern discourses about animal cruelty in parallel to Buddhism and its discourses of animal cruelty. I don't think students necessarily confuse. I don't think they think they're the same. They see them for what it is, that we're holding two things in parallel. To see both what connections emerge and the differences that emerge, and that they're not identical, but that the thinking from one can help us think in a new way of the other. Like it informs it, it deepens it, and perhaps even makes us question like what elements are missing from this that are present in the other one. So it's more of a crosstalk than it is a transposition, is the way I like to think about it. Yeah, I agree. It would be hard to write an article, along these lines, because then we end up thinking of the discipline, right? Like, what does our discipline ought to? How does our discipline frame it?
Demands. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think, well, part of the implication there, you haven't said it explicitly, but then is then writing an article, say, or publishing in a certain mode, then the best way to do this kind of thinking, right? And
yeah, just to pick up on that, and since I want to spotlight Verge for this,
yeah, absolutely.
Just to say that, and to thank Charlotte Eubanks, because my own undisciplining, tentative as it is, is in some sense was encouraged by Charlotte, who encouraged some of us to join the MLA, which, again, you step out of your Asian studies discipline, and then you sort of have to start asking yourself, how would I repose this question to be heard by this different audience, which then led me to read about world literature, to step out of things I might normally read, to read more about all these debates that are taking place about world literature, which then culminated in an article in Verge, which I think they are providing a venue for some of that undisciplining that allows us to, maybe at least it had me step out of the constraints of how I might phrase and frame a question, and have me frame it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean they're also. I mean, I think one of the things that Charlotte and Tina Chen are doing is really thinking about different formats too for doing intellectual work. It's not necessarily the 6 to 11,000 word kind of article, but recognizing that really great, really productive and provocative scholarship can happen in different forms. I think is also part of that. I wanted to.
Sorry, just wanted to add one final
Please,
thing.
Yeah.
The undisciplining, the piece that came out in the LA Review of Books, Undisciplining Victorian Studies, they begin polemically with, how, like reading Middlemarch or Jane Eyre or something like that, that, there's a way in which Victorian studies has said, okay, we're doing critical race studies over here, so that it allows us to then retreat to a race negative, a declivity, right?
Sure.
A race, like, to Middlemarch or whatever, right? And so that we hold these as separate because we hold these as separate. And the polemic is to say, well, what if we decided not to hold these as separate? How would we have to start doing things a little differently?
Differently, yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you.
No,
Go ahead.
not at all. Yeah, no, sure. No, I was going to. The questions are pouring in now, and so I wanted to maybe go to, there's a question from Hwaji Shin, which I think is particularly relevant right this moment. So she says, thank you for a wonderful talk today. It really gave me a set of great ways to teach about Japan in my own sociology course. While it is clear to us the importance of studying race and developing anti-racist pedagogy, we also face the counterforce today in the US, increasing attacks against critical race studies in K-12 and beyond. I would appreciate it if you could share your thoughts on this negative attack against our ongoing efforts as scholars and educators. What role do you think we as scholars of Japanese studies play in this kind of debate?
That is a wonderful
question there for you.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've been reading with alarm. Well, thank you, Professor Hwaji Shin, for that. I enjoyed your talk. I listened to your own webinar. Enjoyed it very much. Yes, I'm reading with alarm as various legislatures around the country take down and ban, etc., critical race studies. And a part of me, what could you repeat the latter part of the question? How should I maybe see it in writing?
I think it's moved to the maybe to the answer tab, but the I'm sorry, it's still in the open part. But what role do you think we as scholars of Japanese studies play in this kind of debate?
Yes. I think for the most part we have been sort of sidelined or exist at the margins of the debate because the state legislatures, at least, have not caught on to the fact that critical race studies might take place anywhere outside of the borders of studying America per se, right? And I may be mistaken. There may be initiatives to stop the teaching of racism against anti-Americans. My very to the extent that I know, Japanese studies has not been labeled in this way as somehow dangerous, injurious to the public school mind. And maybe what that affords us is a greater responsibility that we do it and maybe adopt the language of critical race studies and flag it as such, that it's coming from all these different places that these legislatures might not necessarily assume it's taking place. So to join the effort and to flag it as such.
Thank you for that. You have a little time left, and there's a question, it seems, from a student, so I want to try to highlight that since we love questions from students.
Yes.
So this is from Sydney Olney. Forgive me, Sydney, if I'm not pronouncing your name properly, but who writes, as a student applying to PhD programs in the fall, I am curious about the potential applications of these modules in, quote, teaching to teach. How can institutions promote anti-racist ideals not only in their undergraduate curriculums, but also in the training of their graduate students?
I'm going to defer a little to Professor Jackson, who has been engaged in the training of graduate students, right, through his JSAP project. So I think it's an excellent question. I think that graduate students, as they propose their, develop their own vocabularies, read like voraciously across these different disciplines, are going to come up with innovative ways of teaching it. Even as I was preparing this talk, I was thinking graduate students are probably doing so much more. I ought to know what graduate students are doing because they're probably at the forefront of putting together modules like this. So I absolutely think that graduate students ought to be doing it. Senior scholars ought to be helping in any way we can. And I know that Professor Jackson has been doing this work, the real labor of this work, by putting together the JSAP project and keeping his eye trained on a future pipeline of students who will take this work in their own brilliant and new directions. We're like in the middle of replowing the field so that we can have these new shoots, right? So I defer to him.
No,
He's doing this work.
No, that's very kind of you. I mean, that's your check is in the mail, Professor. Yeah, it's very kind, Professor Selinger. No, I mean, I would say, I would say, and I think I'd hope that the students, Harrison and Sophie and Rachel, I mean, I think it's important to say that they're brilliant and amazing, but none of them are technically Japanese studies students, and I think that that's why it works. And Sydney, you've asked, but the application date is closed, and we just actually finished choosing the participants of the graduate student syllabi workshop that's happening later this month. But I want to say, maybe as a note to end on, and we can address some of the other questions in another forum, maybe, if that's helpful. So I do see that there are other questions and I want to get to them. But, I think it's important to say that it's important for me to not presume that this is reparative work for the sake of Japanese studies or for Premodern. I think that already kind of narrows the kind of scope. And I think that it's also important to say that there are some brilliant students, who have tried to generate these really great ideas and have been really discouraged by some of these systems in the field. And I know that this is true certainly for students of color who have been, who've been told that their interest in some of these ideas is irresponsible or not relevant, or there were folks that who aren't trained and aren't interested in kind of learning more themselves about some of these approaches or some of these ideas, rather than admitting as much, instead hide behind this kind of guise of professorial identity, this persona. Either tell them to go elsewhere, or that this isn't good enough, right? And as opposed to admitting the ignorance there. So I want to just be very clear and say, I wish you much luck, Sydney, and I hope that all your dreams come true. But a lot of the work that we've been trying to do with JSAP, it hasn't been funded.
Right.
I think it's illegible in lots of these kind of standard funding structures. I think it has to happen really improvisationally. I'm really inspired by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's notion of the undercommons and study that doesn't have to default to an institutional kind of encapsulation. I think that's the way it has to be, and that a lot of this work is not going to come from institutional structures as they presently exist, that you're going to have to do it on your own and find folks. And I think that's really exciting. One can be depressed about that or really energized by that and saying, okay, it's great that I can talk to Harrison about sustainability and thinking about environmental racism in Minamata and also in Flint, Michigan, or that I can talk to Sophie about Japanese incarceration and try that to discussions of chattel slavery or other types of Portuguese slavery, for instance, or I can talk to Rachel about Francophone Caribbean Black feminist writing, and these critiques of imperialism and colonialism that are completely relevant to discussions that are happening in the context of post-Meiji Japan. So, and I learn a lot from those folks. Yeah.
And just to encourage Sydney, that in some sense, we may be teaching our material, but we're always mindful of where the students where the students' heads, like what issues. The classroom is not an empty flat space. They're bringing in their concerns, and they are undoubtedly having these thoughts and wondering if these make connections to the contemporary moment. I say, why not embrace it? Why not embrace the anachronism? So this is to encourage you, Sydney. in that vein.
And maybe just to pick up on that, this since we're past time,
Okay.
I love speaking with you and learning from you, and every conversation, I should have said this in the introduction, I have with you is productive. And I can say that
Same
about
here.
no, but I mean, that's very, very rare, one doesn't feel depleted. One feels actually energized in talking with you, which is also great, particularly in pandemic land. I think it's also maybe important to say that there's something. It's important that this kind of work and thinking doesn't have to be ever have to be reducible to an institutional structure.
Right.
And I think that maybe this is a way to go head back to Huaji Shin's question. I think it's a mistake in some ways to presume that the work has to stay within these
Yeah.
departmental or kind of disciplinary contexts that it needs to. And the best work, we see this in terms of we're looking at kind of historically, civil rights movement is a great example, kind of third world liberation movement is a great example. Things like teach-ins, things like students teaching other students and teaching professors was outside, using classrooms as spaces, but not getting credit for that work.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's kind of what I have in the back of my mind to Jain's earlier question.
Mm-hmm.
That's great to learn and be a scholar, but what do you do? What about the knowledge or the learning or the study that takes place that's not licit and is not
Yeah.
legible and
Right.
therefore is actually far more valuable, So I
Right.
think that along those lines, I'm so grateful to
Thank
all the work
you.
that you're doing, and grateful to the JSAP team and all the staff at CGS who help to support what we're trying to do. We'll figure out ways to respond to some of the questions that weren't answered. I see them. Um, Torkel has made a clarification. I see that as well. In addition to Tomi Tonomura has asked a question about definition, and Alison Alexi has also asked a question. So we do see you. We'll figure out a way to respond and then maybe post that as well.
Okay.
But Professor Selinger, thank you so much again for all your time, all of your thoughtfulness, characteristic thoughtfulness, and just your presence. I think it's really amazing that you're in the field and inspiring. Quietly and otherwise, I think, for us to just do a better job. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody join me in thanking Professor Vyjayanthi Selinger for her presentation today. Take care,
Take care.
everyone.